This talk is about a really amazing, relatively new person on the scene in architecture, David Adjaye. David Adjaye was born in 1966 in Tanzania, but actually his family is from Ghana. He has deep, deep roots in Ghana in Africa. His father was a diplomat and so was assigned to Tanzania. That's why the family was there when David was born. He grew up in this diplomatic family, so they went many different places. They were on diplomatic assignment in Egypt and in Yemen and in Lebanon, so generally Africa, Middle East, and that's kind of where he grew up. So he had a lot of exposure to a lot of different places as a kid. He also had a younger brother who was confined to a wheelchair. And he says that gave him a real sensitivity to the social aspect of architecture and it serving all kinds of people and not just a kind of person. So he went to the Royal Academy of Art for his architecture degree, and he graduated with a Master of Architecture there. Then he went for a couple of years and worked for, again, as so many of these people, worked for very, very good architects. He worked for a while for David Chipperfield, really great British architect. He worked for a while for Eduardo Santa de Moura, who's a really excellent Portuguese architect. And then he came back to London and for a while established a practice with a colleague, a partnership. That didn't work out so well, and in 2000 he started his own firm, David Adjaye and Associates. Also in 1999, at that same time, he started this incredible, ambitious research project. He made the decision that he was going to visit every capital of every country in Africa, and he was going to document the architecture of those cities. Now, honestly, this is hard information to come by. People have not documented the urban scene in all of these capitals of Africa, ever. Usually what you see of African architecture is more village architecture, more vernacular architecture. This was just the everyday metropolitan scene in these African capitals. Now, I think this is David Adjaye saying, I'm African. I want to know who I am. I want to know what this architecture is about of my roots. And I want to study it and understand it. Now, this is part of something I mentioned when we were reading the article on the aesthetics of postmodernism. And we talked a little bit about whether or not environments are particularly suited to certain ethnicities or races or genders or whatever. I think this is David Adjaye sharpening his REC identity in psychological terms, his racial, ethnic, and cultural identity. And there's a long history of artists and significant players in the world really gaining an enormous amount out of a kind of introspection into their own racial, ethnic, and cultural identity. My favorite person in this regard is James Baldwin. I don't know how much you guys know of James Baldwin. He was a major, major American cultural figure in the 1950s and 1960s. In some ways, he was the theory person for the civil rights movement. There were other people who were maybe more politically active. There were other people who were more involved in making legislation. There were other people who were more involved in the day-to-day protests. But he was the idea man of the civil rights movement. What is it we're trying to do here? What is this relationship between black and white in America? How is that different from the rest of the world? What is it we're dealing with? And he wrote essays and novels that really were based on a consciousness about what it was for him to be an African American. And he spent, a significant portion of his life sharpening his own REC identity, his own racial, ethnic, and cultural identity. And he saw that as a springboard for him making great novels and great literature. And it absolutely, it worked in his case. Now, he also would have been very plugged into other people who were doing the same thing in other areas. So there were people in political fields like Medgar Evers or Malcolm X or Martin Luther King who were sharpening their racial, ethnic, cultural identity in order to make political change. And there were people certainly in music, all of Motown, the blues, jazz. So much of that is based in artists who were very conscious of their racial, ethnic, cultural identity, studied deeply the roots that they had there, and used that again as a springboard for making music. One of James Baldwin's great mentors was an artist named Beaufort Delancey, who he had done that in painting. And that was a model for James Baldwin doing that in writing. And not so different from other African American writers of the era, Maya Angelou, Richard Wright. There is a history here of people delving into their own racial, ethnic, and cultural identity and finding an inspiration in it for the work that they do. In these last few talks, we're going to just be looking at one person in a talk. And we're really just going to be focusing on kind of one thing they're interested in, rather than looking at their whole theory. And in the case of David Adjaye, I want us to just kind of focus on what might there be in one's delving into racial, ethnic, and cultural identity that might be able to be inspirational for architecture. And I'll have to say, I've heard David Adjaye speak. I've researched as best I could, his background and his interests and so on. I am not telling you something I know for a fact because I heard him say it, or I know for a fact because I read it. I'm telling you an observation I see in that work, and I want in class, we can discuss this. Maybe I'm full of shit on this, but I definitely see a very strong power that David Adjaye got from a keen awareness of his own REC identity. And we know he spent more than a decade researching and working on understanding the architectural roots of the cultures that he came from. So in the early part of his practice, he was very plugged into an arts community in London. He had a lot of friends who were artists, and often in his early years he did studios for them, maybe a house and studio. And often they're in one little district in London where I've gone and looked at those buildings that are in that district. At the time he did these buildings, that was a rough part of town. And these artists were moving into a rough part of town. And the buildings we're seeing a bit as anomalies in this kind of rugged neighborhood. One of them is a house called the Dirty House. Not 100% sure why it's called the Dirty House. It is black. And as you can see, nothing else in the whole neighborhood around is black. So it's very crisp, modern, kind of elemental building. But whereas if that were white, we'd just see it as modernism as usual. But it's not white. It's very clearly anti-white. It's black. And it has a very, very strong presence. It is actually a renovation of an old factory building. So most of that black is just paint on an existing building. But the thing that really marked it was this striking use of the color black. He did another kind of house again for an artist. This one is for a photographer, does a lot of architectural photography. And again, in a neighborhood that, this is this kind of dominant brick color there. And this is a start from scratch house, not a renovation. But again, strikingly black. And in this case, it's made out of blackened wood, which is burnt wood. You burn it on the outside, and that actually gives it resistance to weathering and to rot. It's an ancient technique of preserving wood. There's a kind of mysterious quality to this sunken house, tucked away, and this enigmatic black color. But a very, very simple, modern, elemental house. But now the striking feature of it really is the fact that it's black. So that was characteristic of many of these earlier projects that Adjaye did. Then in the midst of this research, where he's going all over Africa, and he's looking at all these cities, not the romantic, village, countryside Africa, but the 21st century, often nasty, poverty-ridden, difficult city. He's looking at those cities and photographing them. And one of the things that's really striking in those photographs is the amount of pattern and color that's in those buildings. And this is a very powerful thing in African culture, the prominence of color and the prominence of geometry. Many of the images he has in those cities are marketplaces. You see the people dressed in very colorful garb. They have tremendous fabrics in Africa where they've woven this geometry into in colorful patterns. So now, this is not David Adjaye having his style. This is David Adjaye now responding to a particular condition and drawing on maybe another aspect of racial, cultural, ethnic identity that he might have picked up in those travels in African cities. So in this case, he's being asked to design a library for a tough neighborhood in London. It's a neighborhood where there was a history of a great library being there that was a Jewish library primarily, and it had a tremendous amount of literature in Yiddish. That was kind of the history of the library neighborhood when it was a Jewish neighborhood. It's not a Jewish neighborhood anymore. But it wasn't exactly a neighborhood that had a lot of library-going people. And so the library system in London got the idea of maybe we don't really want to make a library in the normal sense. Maybe we want to make what we might call an idea store, a place where you go to get ideas, to learn about ideas. So this was the first of a number of buildings that the library system in London did that they called idea stores. And this one was located really appropriately right on a major market street in this neighborhood. And that's not, you can see the fruits and vegetables there, and yeah, there are fruits and vegetables in this market. But this is the market where people go for everything. This is where you get your underwear. This is where you get your deodorant. This is where, it's just a vendor place, and not particularly beautiful or romantic market, but that street is really where the everyday, mercantile activity of the neighborhood is, and it's very colorful. And there's lots and lots of people going by all the time. So David Adjaye, in a way, just takes that liveliness and activity of that market, that colorfulness, it's a very ethnically diverse neighborhood, and the kind of colorfulness of that ethnically diverse neighborhood, and he makes the idea store have both pattern, very strong geometry, and color in a way, obviously, that the other buildings around don't have. There also is this wonderful kind of embracing of the market. So the building kind of jumps out, and the escalator is outdoors, not indoors. And you're almost inside the building before you know you're inside the building by this kind of loggia or porch that's on the outside that really is an extension of the marketplace there. And part of it is trying to invite people in. The idea of this is get those people into the idea store. And there's good interaction on the lower level. You go up that escalator, there's more interaction on the second level. And the whole idea is just, and it's not a library where there's a lot of security at the front door necessarily. There is security at some point. But you're allowed to kind of participate without being scrutinized too much. So they're just inviting the neighborhood into the idea store. And then when you get inside, it's this very casual, very relaxed, very engaging interior with these spectacular views around to the city and this colorful light that's coming in all around. And a very, very different atmosphere probably than people would have been accustomed to in a library. Here you can see gorgeous views out to the Gherkin that we looked at a couple of times ago. But certainly a distinctive but very, very different interior than what we were seeing in those early houses. So there was one kind of notion of this is for art and this is for a kind of person who's operating at a certain intellectual and artistic level. And then I embrace everybody. And so when I'm making something for a neighborhood full of ordinary people with ordinary lives and right off the marketplace there, well, the building needs to have that attitude and engage them in the same way that very precise and esoteric vocabulary engaged the people in those artist studios. So it's a place primarily, there are books, but not a whole ton of books. And there are a whole lot of magazines and a whole lot of newspapers, tons of computers. I love the fact that there's all these little study areas and computer stations that really are right there at the light and looking out to the views with the warmth of the wood all around. It's just got a really engaging, participatory kind of community atmosphere in the idea store. Hugely successful. This was a difficult thing to pull off. A neighborhood that didn't have a strong tradition of everybody meeting at the library, everybody going and taking their kids to the library. How do you draw people in? How do you make it feel open and friendly and lively and inviting for all of them? And he pulled it off in a magnificent way. So he shortly after that got a commission to do a library in the United States, in Washington, D.C. And this again, it seems to me, is him exploring maybe some other aspects of that research that he did for 10 years into these African cities. You may know Washington, D.C. is a minority city. It's one of the largest concentration of African Americans in the United States, and many affluent African Americans, very large middle class African American community there. It's a very strong center for African American culture. So he's doing this neighborhood library, and now not in a disadvantaged neighborhood, a very nice, very well-funded neighborhood library. But what's really striking here are these very strong geometries, very strong patterns. And again, you see that so much in African textiles, in African art, in African printmaking, these bold, strong geometries. And he's using that with light to really animate this extraordinary, inventive exterior facade for the building. Now, it's all sheathed in glass, but some of that would be opaque glass, and some of that would be darkly tinted, transparent glass. And so on the outside, you're just seeing this very subtle alternation of solid glass and more or less clear glass. But it really makes, both on the outside and on the inside, an extraordinary play of pattern in the building and a light quality on the inside of the building. So, and again, I think mining this research he's been doing and trying to pull out of himself something that is characteristic, perhaps a springboard he could utilize that another architect couldn't utilize. What is it that we talked early in the semester about? What is it? How do we have our own background and values influence our work? Well, in a very powerful way, I think he is using his background and values to influence the work he's doing. Another building he did relatively recently is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. And again, now he's back in the arts world. There seems to be a kind of expression he does when he's dealing with everyday people, library, something like that. And then a little bit different maybe when he's working with the more esoteric art world. And in this case, it's a contemporary art museum right in downtown Denver. Now, it is made of black glass. And yet this dusk shot, you can see that. It's a very interesting assembly of the black glass, which is heavily tinted but transparent. And then behind it, a kind of milky layer of film that actually softens that light tremendously because it's an art museum and you don't want the UV light. But also then on the outside gives it this kind of enigmatic, soft glow. You actually cannot see through any of that glass. It's in the galleries, and those are walls they hang paintings on. But there is this kind of soft glow. It's very interesting dealing with light. But in general, you look at the building and it's black glass. You can vaguely see that behind it is this milky white backing that is translucent, so you're not seeing into the building. Occasionally then there is an aperture where you actually do see in or out of the building there. Solid black. And then as you go into the building here, you can see revealed that this is still outdoors, but you can see revealed that section of the black glass on the outside and the milky translucent surface on the inside that really is pretty much prevalent throughout the rest of the building. There also is at the lower portion where it meets the street, there's actually board formed concrete that is also black, painted black. So the building is strikingly black. But then when you get inside, it's completely different. It's like a geode with this black skin and then white on the inside. And there light is let in from the top, very dynamic spatial interlocking on the inside, and all of these white surfaces much more appropriate for the display of art, and the kind of milky, soft light coming in from outside. But then interestingly, when you get to an area that's not about the art, we're back to a completely different expression. Now it's wood and rich and colorful, and this is the shop and the bookstore and the place where you get gifts, and it has a completely different atmosphere than the space for art in the museum itself. That's also true in the cafe, which is on the top floor, and there's a whole kind of terrace and cafe and nice views of the city, and that's all made out of wood and warmer materials, much more color, much more pattern than in those art spaces which are more black and white. So those are all buildings that Adjaye did, really in some ways preparing him in a unique way to do the building that he's most well known for at this point, which is the National African American Museum in Washington, D.C. So the National Museum of African American History and Culture is probably the building for which David Adjaye is best known. It's right on the mall in Washington, D.C. And one of the most striking things you see in it just immediately is that Washington is this white city and the monuments are white. So there's the Lincoln Monument that's white here. There's the Washington Monument that's white here. Out on that spit is the Jefferson Memorial that's white here. On the axis back over here is the White House. On the axis back over here is the Capitol building, which is white. All of the major monuments of Washington are white. And then in the midst of that sits the African American Museum, which is notably not white. And already it's setting itself apart. This is about another culture. This is about another perspective on what America is. And I think that the building says that very eloquently. It was actually based on some African images that Adjaye was very entranced by. There was a headdress of a native prince that was these 3 tiers angled like that. And there are references to that kind of geometry in art in Africa in several ways. So he's drawing rather directly from African images in that. The whole thing is made of a kind of light screen, as you can see here. So the screen on the outside softens the light as it comes into the building. A huge kind of forecourt here, and then a porch that takes you under that screen, very delicate screen. This would have been digitally fabricated metal that formed that. And then from that porch, you're taken in the front door and into a very big, open, gracious lobby. And then really remarkably, the building then, the architecture and your experience of it is used very much to tell a story, and to tell a story about the African American experience in the United States. And so the first thing you do when you go in is you either get on a very, very big elevator. This is like an elevator that holds 25 or 30 people. And you haul into this big elevator and you go deep, deep, deep down into the ground. Or you might take the escalator and again you go deep, deep, deep down into the ground. And you're leaving this area of light and filigree and really sort of beautiful motifs that come from Africa, and you're going deep down into the ground. And you find this subterranean experience of being in darkness, being away from the rest of the world, being isolated. And this is the story of slavery in the United States. So that you get in the exhibits all of the kind of discussion of how the slaves were brought over and what their experience was, and the horrible tragedy that happened as a part of slavery. And slowly, slowly you sort of ramp your way back up as this story is being told to you in the exhibitions. And then you finally emerge again at ground level, and you've got the light again, and you've got this beautiful pattern of the filigree. And then you're exposed to more contemporary experiences of African American life. And now you see the huge contributions that African Americans have made in the arts, in music in particular, in athletics, on political scene. So there is a real kind of explanation of positive, progressive experiences of African Americans. And that happens kind of over and over and in different ways, and it's much, much more upbeat, and you're in the light. You move in and out of this open, spacious, light-filled circulation space as you go to and from those exhibits that are about a more contemporary experience in America. So the building is telling the difference between slavery and the march to freedom, and the exhibits are really beautiful. They tell a wonderful story in the museum. Now, I'm making the argument here that this is someone who has gotten very in touch with his background, his racial, ethnic, and cultural identity, his history. He has used that not in a kind of pastiche, literal way, but in a very deep, comprehensive way to look at individual problems and to find ways to use that cultural identity as a springboard for making really amazing architecture. Okay, see ya.